So I think we can start. So hello again. I'm Tanya. I'm the Client Success Lead at ADRES. Thank you for joining our second webinar. For those who didn't get the chance to be with us on our first webinar, I will start with a brief introduction to our company before we dive into the main content. So ADRES is an international consultancy company at the biopharma industry. Our clients are startups and companies across the globe, and we specialize in regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and CMC. Today, Roy Zeibel, our co-CEO and data integrity specialist, will lead us through the mystery of the 21 CFR Part 11. Excuse me, mystery of the second 21 CFR Part 11. The webinar will last about 50 minutes, followed by 10 minutes Q&A session. So feel free to write your questions in the QA section below, and Roy will address them in the end. After the session, you will receive the presentation and certificates of the training directly to your emails. So thank you once again for being here today. And now, Roy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And thank you, everybody, for joining our second session about data integrity. Today's session, as Tanya mentioned, is the 21 CFR Part 11 mystery, compatible but not compliant. I want to remind that last time we discussed the principles of data integrity. We went over the regulation, the demands, and today we are going to focus on computerized system validation, which is the topic in general of our session today. Since most of the activities that are performed in startups are performed in electronic systems, and there is a regulatory demand regarding those systems. Most data integrity related regulation and guidelines address this issue. And we'll take the 21 CFR Part 11 as a reference point, but the other regulatory bodies have their own guidelines and regulations, and they all more or less align, as we said also about the data integrity. So today's agenda is first we'll have an introduction to the 21 CFR Part 11. Then we'll discuss the difference between compliance and compatibility. Then we'll discuss, look a little bit at the GAMP5. GAMP5 is a very important and a popular guideline for electronic computerized system validation. And we'll see a little bit of the principles that are there. And then we'll address the issue of non-compatible systems, how to deal with them. And then we'll have time for Q&A. I think that the session will last about maybe less than what Tanya estimated. I estimated around 40 minutes, more or less. So let's start with what is an FDA CFR in general, just for those who are not familiar. The definition is CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations, which contain the rules issued by US federal agencies. The 21 CFR is specific to FDA regulations, and it governs food, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. And the purpose of Part 11 is to focus specifically on electronic records and electronic signatures. So the first thing that we need to understand is that the CFR Part 11 is a binding regulatory demand that we have to follow once we are working under a regulated environment. So let's get to know a bit about the CFR. The definition is that it governs the use of electronic records and signatures to ensure authenticity, integrity, and reliability. This might sound familiar to those who have participated in our previous webinar, where we mentioned the term ALCOA. ALCOA, just to remind, is an acronym for attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate. We went over the definition last time, but you can see that in general, you may say that the 21 CFR Part 11 aims to ensure that ALCOA principles are maintained in the computerized systems. That means ALCOA is you could say, a synonym to data integrity. The objective is to ensure that all electronic records are equivalent to paper records. That was the original purpose. Today, the guidelines will say that if you have a system that allows more confidence than a paper record, then you should use the tools to allow the maximum confidence possible, but not less than paper records. And its application is to all the systems that are used in order to manufacture, to generate data that is going to be submitted to regulatory authorities. Everything that is going to be reviewed by them has to be produced, generated in a system that is compatible with the demands, that is compliant. And any system that deals with data that might have an effect on patient safety, even if the data is not specifically eventually submitted, then that system has to follow the same regulation as well. So everything that is going to be reviewed by the regulators and everything that has to do with risk. And I would say that a good decision would be that anything that poses any risk on business activity that should be under the same controls. The key guidelines about computerized system validation are here. Like the previous time, I put together a list of highlights. The first 5 are, you can access them freely. And for the GAMP5 and PDA, you have to purchase them or you need to pay for them in some way. And but you can see that there are a lot of references to computerized systems, and there are always guidelines that are updating the demands. Even the GAMP5 has a new edition addressing also AI tools and etc. I would say that if you have to get into a deep process of validation in your company, I would have someone go over the GAMP5 guideline and make sure that you do things properly. Again, we'll talk about it a little bit in our session. And now let's take a look at a few highlights from the 21 CFR Part 11. So these are some quotations, but they give the essence of the main topics that are covered by the demands, and we'll understand those topics after going over these quotations. So the first one, the system must be validated to ensure accuracy, reliability, consistent, intended performance, and the ability to discern invalid or altered records. So that goes to say that it needs to be validated. Systems must generate audit trails that document all records changes. So we'll dive into the audit trail in a short while, what it means and what the requirement is. Access control mechanisms must ensure only authorized individuals can modify records. So we'll discuss the permission and the access control. Electronic signatures must be linked to their respective records to prevent tampering. So we'll talk a little bit about the electronic signatures as well towards the end. and procedures must be in place to ensure secure and controlled access to systems. And this is very important, and we'll elaborate on that, that the demand is not just that the system has all the capabilities and is validated, but you have to have procedures, that means SOPs, that ensure that the access to the system is controlled, but I can add that ensure that all of the use of the system is controlled. And not only how you use it to perform tests, but how you ensure that all the data is collected correctly and no unauthorized modifications are performed. So if we highlight the scope of the regulation, the core requirements are audit trails, system validation, electronic signatures, and access control. So let's dive into those terms. The first one, the audit trail. We mentioned in our previous session the term metadata. The metadata gives us the context in which the data was generated. And it is crucial in order to assess the data, in order to understand the data, in order to know the correctness of the data. And the audit trail is a report that is generated by the systems. And what it allows us is a traceability of all the activities conducted in the system. So it sums up a lot of metadata about when the system was used, who is the user that used it, under which method was he acting, or he or she, sorry. Was it for manufacturing, for QC? What product are they working on? And the audit trail is a requirement in a system that is used in a regulatory environment, a regulated environment. And the system has to allow you to review the audit trail, and you have to make sure that all unwanted actions are captured in it. That means that all deletions, all alterations, all attempts to access unpermitted data or methods, everything that was conducted that could be unauthorized needs to be captured. And of course, it needs to come up in the review. So the review has to be effective, and corrective actions need to be taken once anything is brought up. And so this is an audit trail. The systems have to have an audit trail. The next one is system validation. We said that the systems have to be validated, and validation, just to make sure that it is familiar to anyone in here, I'll explain. In very general terms, validation is used in many fields in our industry. So in general, you could say that validation is a process, a methodological process, in which you define how the system is supposed to work, and you define the tests to make sure that you can be sure that if those tests are passed, then the system is ready to go. So you define the test, and then you perform the tests, and if everything passes, then the system is valid. There are common steps to it. You start with the specifications of the system. Usually there are the user requirement, the functional, and the design specifications. They are known as URS, FS, and DS. And then there are the respective qualifications, which are the tests, the installation, operational, and performance qualifications, known as IQ, OQ, and PQ. There are sometimes additional steps. Sometimes you don't have to follow all of these steps. We'll discuss it a little bit, sorry, once we get to the GAMP5 part. What I want to stress here is that everything that is required in the systems by the CFR has to be validated. That means, for example, the audit trail that we mentioned, which is a part of the system, has to be validated as well. And not just the validation that ensures that the HPLC knows how to read the samples that we test there, but we have to make sure that all of the demands, the regulatory demands, are validated as well, are part of the validation. The next requirement is access control. The access to the systems, it needs to be restricted and controlled. That means that in general, you could say that the access to a system needs to be granted only to the users that need to have the access for their work. And the privileges is what the users can do, are capable of doing in that system. The privileges granted to each user should align their roles. That means that they need to be able to do everything that the role demands and nothing else. This actually goes to protect the users themselves, because once you prevent a user from reviewing data that they're not supposed to review it, then in the audit trail, you will never find any trace of them performing that action. They might have done it accidentally, without intention, but that would have to lead to investigation. And you just prevent those situations by restricting the access. Usually what you do is you create permission level, access levels according to the roles, and then you can create groups and you can add the privileges needed to that group and remove any other privilege. And there should be a system administrator that controls the list of the users and their roles and their privileges. So anytime you can look at the system and make sure that it is aligned with the list, the approved list that the administrator holds. Now, after understanding the core requirements, of course, you can always read the full regulation. Now I want to discuss what we named our session, the common misconceptions. And the first misconception or myth is that using a Part 11 compatible system guarantees compliance. And you can find many startups that quite naively, they just buy a system that has a certificate that announces that it is Part 11 compatible. And then those startups think that they can start using that system in any way they want because it is compatible. And what we need to understand first is that compliance requires proper governance, process, and training, not just the technology. It's not sufficient that the system is compatible. The use of the system and the governance over the system has to be compliant with the regulation. So you can say that the term compatible means that the system has all the capabilities to allow you to follow the regulation. For example, it has the capability to control the users. It has the capability to review an audit trail, but it doesn't mean that you do all of that. So first, you need to understand that compliance is the way you use the system and not the system itself. And that is why not the system needs to be compliant, but the whole process of using the system, including the system itself, they all need to be compliant, they all need to be validated. Second, the term compatible is not a formal term. There isn't a regulatory body that gives you that term. It's a self-declaration by the vendors. They just go over the CFR and make sure that their system has all the tools that are required by the CFR. But even so, it doesn't mean that these tools are going to be easy for use. And then if it's very difficult to use these tools. That means that the way you're using that system is not compliant. For example, there was a client that started using a system in their labs, and it was a new system, but still they had a certificate declaring that it is compatible. And we couldn't understand how the audit trail is generated, so we had a call with the vendors. This is something that I truly recommend, to have a call with the vendors to understand your system better. And then we realized that in order to receive the audit trail, we need to email the vendors themselves and specify exactly what we need to see in the audit trail, and then they can bring it back to us. And this is a process that doesn't make sense. I assume that they had to do it that way because the part of letting the user using the audit trail wasn't validated at that point. But that means that it's very easy to state that you have the compatibility. It doesn't mean that you as users of the system are going to easily comply with the regulation. The next one is, if my system was validated by the vendor, it means it is compliant with regulations. So now you say it's not only that my system is compatible, but the vendor validated it. But what the vendor in most cases does is validation of the proper installation of the system. They make sure that the system was properly installed and is ready for use the way it is in the beginning, before you start configuring the system and before you start defining the way that you work with it. They're not going to make sure that you use the audit trail correctly. They're not going to make sure that you control the access. And they are not going to make sure that you configure it correctly. If they do a good service, they might help you with that because they should have some relevant experience, but you can't just rely on that in order to decide that the way you use the system is valid. And I want to just give you an example. I visited a CDMO, and one of their systems, I asked the operators about the audit trail, and they didn't have an audit trail. And then when I raised the issue with the CEO, he told me, wait a second. He went out of the room, and 5 minutes later, he came back with a large folder, which was the validation of the system. And then he reads in the system, goes in the folder, he goes over the documentation, and then he says, aha, I found it. It has an audit trail. And then I told him, but the people said that they don't know, they aren't aware of any audit trail. And then he said, yes, I can see that the people that participated in the validation, they are not working in our company anymore. So they have an audit trail. It was validated by the vendor. They could use it properly, but they simply didn't because they weren't aware of it and they didn't have any relevant SOP to review the audit trail. So again, the thinking that if it was validated, it means that it is compliant. It's two different things. It's the vendor's validation is of the system, and compliant relates to the whole process of using the system. So if we want to understand a bit more how a system can be compatible but not compliant, just to give you some more examples, a system is labeled Part 11 compatible and it supports audit trails and signatures, but it fails compliance. First, because of it's lacking the validation documentation. And this is maybe it's very basic, but it's not done by everybody. First, look at the systems that you're using. Some of them were used only for R&D in the past, and now they have moved to GMP or GMP-related activities or GCP activities. And you might have not validated it once you performed the change. the validation needs to be done for every change in the system. You need to revalidate. It doesn't mean that you need to go over the whole process from the beginning, but it does mean that you need to validate and you need to decide the scope of the validation according to the change and the risk that it poses. So make sure that all of your systems have the validation documentation. Another option is poor access control. I've seen in facilities that the list of users wasn't aligned with the list that appeared in the system itself. The controlled list was different than what I saw in the system itself. Sometimes it's a matter of IT. Sometimes the IT is not a part of the quality system, is not governed by the quality unit, and then they might perform changes that are not controlled, and they could make the system not valid anymore. Missing SOPs for electronic record management. If we go back to the audit trail, if there's no SOP explaining how to review the audit trail and what needs to be captured in the audit trail, then just looking at the audit trail without a clear definition of what you're looking for is insufficient. I can give you a couple of more examples. I've been to another CDMO, and they had a company that came and validated all of their systems. So it wasn't the vendors. After the vendors installed the systems and validated the installation of the systems, they had another company that came and validated it according to the 21 CFR Part 11 demands. And then when they took me to the tour, they took me to one of the HPLC systems, and they showed me the operating system that was validated, and it looked really good. Then I asked one of the users, when are you allowed to delete results? And the first issue was that he didn't know that the answer was never. He said, I'm not sure, I need to check it. So I'm just touching one issue that is big, but we're not going to cover today, which is training. We're going to talk more about it next time. But the more relevant issue that I encountered there was that on the HPLC itself, it was operated via a computer. But on the HPLC itself, there was a panel, an operation panel, that you could operate the system through it. And the results that it yielded weren't captured in the main system. That means that that panel allows you to do one of the specifically things that are banned by regulatory bodies that is called testing into compliance. You can perform as many tests that are uncontrolled until you get the right results, and only then move to the controlled system. Of course, I had no doubt that no one there was doing that. They were really surprised that the system could be operated through it because they didn't pay any attention to it. But at least they needed to have a sign next to it telling users that the use of the panel is prohibited. They needed to add it to the SOP. And if it could be technically disabled or the access to it denied, that would be best. So this is an example that only through a process in which you challenge the systems according to the CFR, but not just according to a checklist in which you cover the demands, but you look at the whole system and you try to look for any loopholes in the system, you can find something like that. The regulatory bodies, the FDA many times recommends having a regulatory advisor, consultant, and all of these cases that I mentioned are of clients that I visited. But you can have an expert in your own company. If you feel that your operation is big enough, you can have an expert in your own company that has that issue in mind. And what you need to do is have audits. And in those audits, challenge the systems the way that I explained. And Okay, let's go to GAMP5. As I mentioned before, the GAMP5 is guidance on computerized system validation. And it is a risk-based framework. And the risk-based is very important here because what we're going to look at here, first, the whole concept of the validation it is on the GAMP5. You can read it there and understand the whole process of the requirements and the qualification. But another interesting part of the GAMP is the definition of the four categories. There used to be five, but category 2 was deleted. The four categories of systems that are used in a regulated environment. And the categories are according to the complexity of the system, and you could say the risk of configuring it in a way that does not ensure that all data generated aligns with the Alcoa principles. The higher the risk, the more validation efforts you'll have to perform. So the first category is infrastructure. That could be operating systems, networks. When we say that for those systems, you don't need to have almost any validation, that means that you just need to make sure that you're using the relevant system to your needs, but you don't need to make sure, for example, that Windows works properly. You do need it as an IT governance, but this is something that you don't need to validate. Already, I want to say that if you have a system that is based on Windows and you could alter the clock on Windows in order to change the timestamp on your results, in new systems, it shouldn't be allowed. But if the possibility is there, that means that even the use of Windows poses some risk. And this is again why I'm saying you have to have someone with that issue on their mind, making sure that all the systems don't allow any alterations that are not controlled to the data. So you have to have your IT at one point or another very much involved in your processes. The second category, category 3 again, we don't have category 2. Category 3 is non-configurable software. And this is an interesting example, Microsoft Excel, that appears also in the GAMP itself, because many of you probably heard of Excel sheet validation, but this is not what I'm referring to here, or the GAMP is referring to here. The reference is to the mere use of Excel. You don't need to validate that once you put a formula correctly into Excel, it works. What you do need to validate is that you put the correct formula. So if you build a form and you want to use it as part of your regulated data processes, then the form needs to be validated. And I'm not going to get into Excel validation in this session, but that needs to be validated. But the mere use of Excel doesn't need to be validated. The software itself doesn't need validation. Category, or just to make sure, again, doesn't need a lot of efforts of validation. You again need to make sure that the program is capable of performing the tasks that you need it to perform. But it's more functional than anything else. Once you get to category 4, and this is a category very commonly found in QC laboratories. You can find it in manufacturing as well. This is a configurable software. Once you are able to configure the software, so that means that the way you use the software is not the same that others use the same software, because you could configure it, and it's not just off-the-shelf software that you use as is, then you need to perform a deeper validation. Then you need to define exactly how you're going to configure it. You need to define the tests and you need to perform the tests and have the whole validation documented properly. So category 4 is usually the major headaches for startups. This is where you start working hard on your validations. Category 5 is even more complex, but usually you wouldn't need to perform the validation yourself because category 5 is systems that you develop yourself. And these systems usually are developed by programmers, and those programmers usually validate their products as a way of work. This is what they do. The same way that you in the startups validate your product that you're developing, they validate the software that they're developing. So usually for category 5, your software engineers will be able to provide you with the relevant validation. I want to add that the risk-based approach is not only about the complexity of the system, you have to take into consideration also the criticality of the system. If it generates data that is only captured in this specific process and you don't have it, you don't have any other process backing up that data, and the data is has an effect or possible effect on product safety, that means that is very critical, and data that is going to be submitted to regulatory bodies as well, and data that if you lose it, then you're going to have to repeat a lot of steps, and you might waste your time and your money that you could consider that to be critical data as well. And we mentioned electronic signatures, so I don't want to go too much into depth with them in this issue because you have pretty common and good tools for electronic signature. The most common, at least products that I know, are DocuSign and Adobe. Both of them have a module that is 21 CFR Part 11 compatible. And once again, the fact that it is compatible doesn't mean that the way you use it is compliant. And those systems are not very hard to use and configure, but we have found that you could make some mistakes in the configuration of them, and those mistakes could mainly cause the wrong time documented in the signature. So I actually asked ChatGPT today, would the GAMP5 consider DocuSign and Adobe category 3 or category 4, since category 3 is non-configurable and DocuSign and Adobe are somewhat configurable? The result was that it's category 3. I would say category 3 as well, because the configuration is very minor. However, the regulator doesn't really care about the category. What they care about is the data integrity. And if your timestamps are not aligned with the real time, are not contemporaneous, then the use of the system is invalid, is not compliant. And that means that even those systems need to have some governance, making sure that they are configured correctly and over time. And after electronic signature, the last topic is what to do with non-compatible systems. We said that the fact that a system is compatible doesn't mean that it is compliant. But does it go the other way around? If it's not compatible, non-compatible, does it mean that it is necessarily non-compliant? And the answer is no, because again, the term compatible is not a regulatory term. What the regulatory bodies are concerned about is the compliance of the system. And you can find some adjacent processes or additions or mitigations to the system that once applied, they would be considered compliant. And here I want to add something else. We mentioned before that you sometimes move from R&D to GMP. And the risk-based approach has to do also with the stage of development you are. The closer you are to commercial manufacturing, the higher the demands will be on the data that you create, you generate, because the more effect you have on more patients. So if you have legacy systems that are not compatible with the CFR, there would be an expectation if the patches that you find are not good enough, there would be an expectation to, at one point, change the system, perhaps towards phase 3, perhaps towards commercial manufacturing. So what you can do with a non-compatible system is develop SOPs to address missing features. What you may do many times is add paper documentation of missing steps, and you can add an oversight, another person that is not taking part of the process, and they're just observing the user in critical points in which there could be a concern for the data, and assures that nothing unauthorized was conducted. I want to just make sure that it is understood. The concern is not about only deliberate alteration that are not allowed, which are illegal. We're also talking about mistakes that could happen. And you want to protect your users all the time from mistakes. You want to get them to the point where if someone asks them, how can I tell that you never deleted anything? Then they would be able to not only answer, I would never think about deleting anything. They would also be able to say, and even if I did want to delete, I'm unable to do it technically. So develop SOPs. You can upgrade or extend the system. Sometimes an upgrade is much cheaper than changing to a new system, and many systems have new versions that you can purchase that are compatible with the CFR, or you can have additions, modules from other vendors that can interface with your system and add tools that would make it compatible and thus easier to be compliant. You can adopt a hybrid approach. You can use the system just for the specific calculation or test that you need, but all the other capabilities of the systems will be done over paper or in another system. And you can plan for a migration. As I said, at one point or another, you'll be expected to move to a compatible system that is easier to work with in order to achieve compliance. So this is it for today's topic. If there are any questions, I'll look at them right now. So please bear with me a couple of minutes more.
Wait, there are 3 questions.
Okay, I'll answer two of the questions. One of them is more specific. So the first one is by Doron. Hi, Doron, how are you? Some existing systems in the market offer a CFR Part 11 compatible module that can be switched on according to need. so that one system can be used for both production and development. What is the regulator's view on this? Are these systems recommended for routine use? So first, there are those systems. These are very good systems because they allow startups to use the same system as Doron mentioned. And as long as the segregation between the operation of R&D and GMP is solid, then the regulator has no problem with that. They would encourage the use of such systems. And since these systems are they're usually newer systems, the vendor would usually be able to advise you on how to configure it in a way that, remember, you always have to make sure that the GMP model will never be affected by any R&D activities. So you have to make sure that one of the options is to have double users per person, one user that is used for the R&D section and one user for the GMP section. This is commonly used, not to be confused with the same user granted to two different people, which is strictly forbidden. So there are many options to work with these systems. Again, as part of the validation, you'll have to make sure that there is no leakage and no way to shift data or activities from one system to the other. So thank you for this, Doron. And the second question is just a question about the GAMP categories. For example, a software for MRI USS can be categorized as GAMP3. So first, I'm not familiar specifically with the MRI USS, so I don't know how similar these systems are to one another. If you asked me about HPLC, I would say that almost guaranteed it's going to be GAMP4 without looking at the system, though you might find very old systems that would be GAMP3. But the question is not what the instrument or the tool that you're using, for example, MRI, and not even what the system is, but the question, in order to decide what category it is how configurable it is. If you are able to configure the system in a way that affects the privileges given to users, the administration of users, the audit trail, does it appear, is it activated or not activated? If you are capable of configuring those, then it is probably GAMP4. And again, it is a matter of complexity of the system and its configuration and that it allows you, and not the use of the system. The use of the system is relevant to the risk it poses with regards to criticality of the data and not the GAMP category. So the last question you please refer to me directly, and I'll try to help you. I want to thank you everyone again for your participation. And just a quick look at our next session, which will be the third out of four. The next session will be on risks and mitigations, handling data integrity as an ongoing process. And here I want to refer to two points that I made in this session. First, I said that the users of the system are the ones that know it best. And it's very important to work with them and ask them, what are you concerned about with this system? When you use the system, is there anything that you always tell yourself, just make sure not to do this because this is risky, and oh, I never knew what this is about, etc. If you have these concerns, raise them. So it's a lot about your staff and their training. And I gave you an example of that user that I asked, when are you allowed to delete results? And the answer was, I don't remember, instead of telling me I'm never allowed to delete results, it has to do with training as well. So we'll talk about the training and controlling the system, the whole system, all of the systems and data integrity in order to keep them compliant through the whole period of using them. I wish you a great evening and goodbye, afternoon, and goodbye. Thank you all.